In a packed congressional chamber watched by 14 million Americans, Jasmine Crockett locks eyes with Steve Scalise and unleashes a storm. The issue? A brutal federal budget plan that slashes free school lunches while granting $52 million in tax breaks to energy giants. As Crockett lays out cold, undeniable facts, the room shifts from political theater to moral emergency. Scalise invokes self-reliance. Crockett fires back with a single line that stops even the cameras. How did one woman's question about a hungry child unravel a powerful man's entire defense in under 90 seconds? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The hearing chamber was lit like a battlefield, cold, clinical, and humming with tension. Photographers lined the walls, their lenses aimed at the two figures who had not yet spoken, but had already divided the nation. At the center sat Steve Scalise, the Republican Majority Leader, hands folded neatly on a folder marked Spending Reform. His face was calm but not warm, stone behind a polished grin. He carried the weight of power like a habit, a man who saw budget cuts not as choices, but as duties. To Scalise, helping the poor meant enabling weakness. Austerity wasn't cruelty, it was virtue. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her seat. No sudden moves, just quiet control. She didn't come in swinging, she came in watching. The daughter of working-class Texans and a former public defender, she knew how power moved when it thought no one was looking. Her suit was dark, but her presence was sharp. She represented more than a district. She carried the faces of every child who skipped lunch because the numbers didn't add up. Unlike Scalise, she didn't speak from spreadsheets. She spoke from scars. This was no ordinary hearing. It was a crucible for a country at war with itself. The agenda read federal budget realignment, but what it really meant was clear. Cuts to Medicare, SNAP, school nutrition programs, the lifelines of America's most vulnerable. Framed as fiscal discipline, the plan was a scalpel aimed at the spine of the working class. Millions watched live, waiting to see which numbers would survive and whose lives would not. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like tension in the bloodstream. The flag hung behind the chair like a silent witness, and beneath it, two visions of America sat in stillness, moments away from collision. And just as the silence threatened to suffocate the chamber, Steve Scalise adjusted the microphone, not to open a dialogue, but to deliver a declaration, one that would split the country down a fault line of policy and principle. "We are living beyond our means," he began, his voice calm, unshaken, eerily so. "And when a nation spends more than it earns, it begins to decay from within." He didn't look at anyone in particular. He didn't have to. His gaze was set straight ahead, eyes fixed like the tip of a bayonet. That is why today I propose targeted reductions, not reckless cuts, but responsible realignment. That means reforming entitlement programs, Medicare, SNAP, and federal school meal funding. He said it like reading from a ledger, as if listing broken bridges or outdated software. No tremor, no pause, just the steady rhythm of a man who had long ago disconnected numbers from names, who could call hunger an inefficiency and poverty a miscalculation. These programs, he added, though well-intentioned, have ballooned beyond control. They discourage productivity, they reward stagnation. They must be corrected for the good of our future. Behind him, a screen lit up with digital bar charts bleeding red, each data point meant to justify the blade. But what the screen didn't show, what it never showed, was a child's empty stomach growling quietly during a math test, or the handwritten note a nurse slipped to a patient apologizing that their insulin refill wouldn't be covered that month. To Scalise, those weren't legislative concerns. They were collateral. He moved through the words with the ease of someone who had rehearsed them in mirrors, briefed with consultants, perfected with speechwriters. He painted his proposal in the language of responsibility, balance, restraint, restoration. But Jasmine Crockett saw the reality beneath each syllable, abandonment with a necktie. He used euphemisms the way surgeons use anesthesia, to numb the pain he was causing. But there was no anesthetic strong enough to dull the truth she knew. And as he concluded with a final phrase, "This is not an act of cruelty, but an act of courage." Jasmine's fingers curled inward, slow and controlled. beneath the mahogany table. Her body was still, her breath even. But her pulse was fire. Because what he called courage, she had seen as cowardice wrapped in spreadsheets. What he called reform, she had watched unravel entire communities. One meal, one prescription, one eviction at a time. Steve Scalise spoke of numbers. Jasmine knew the names, and she was counting every single one. As the final syllables of Scalise's speech dissolved into the cold stillness of the chamber, a deeper silence followed, one not born from awe, but from anticipation. And then, with the slow, deliberate motion of someone preparing to shift the weight of the entire room, Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone. She didn't shout. She didn't rush. Her voice came low and steady, every syllable anchored in something far older than politics. Something earned. "Mr. Scalise," she began, her gaze unflinching, "you say we're broke when it comes to the poor, but we're never broke when it comes to the powerful." The sentence hung in the air like smoke, slow to vanish, impossible to ignore. A stillness followed, not of confusion, but of comprehension. Jasmine didn't give the room time to recover. We always have a crisis when it's time to feed hungry children. We suddenly find scarcity when the issue is housing, medication, or school lunches. But when the request comes from the top floor of a glass tower or the corner office of a defense firm, the money appears like magic. No hearings, no hesitation. She leaned back slightly, but her voice stayed sharp, unwavering. "You framed this hearing around responsibility," she continued, "but I haven't heard a word about moral responsibility." Her eyes scanned the dais slowly, making sure each face felt her question, not just heard it. Who are we really asking to sacrifice? Her tone didn't rise, but the pressure in the room did. A diabetic grandmother trying to survive on $800 a month? A child who relies on a school cafeteria as their only hot meal of the day? She paused, not for effect, but because the silence made the question louder. Or are we just asking the voiceless to bleed so that the well-connected can keep their tax havens and write-offs? She then tapped a small folder beside her. Not showy, just deliberate. "I have the numbers too," she said, "but I also have the names. I have letters from constituents who lost childcare when block grants were slashed, who now ration medication because Medicare no longer covers their brand. These are not abstract burdens. These are real lives that get left off your spreadsheets." Her voice, though even, now carried steel. "The problem isn't that we don't have money. The problem is that we don't have the will to protect people without it." No one moved. The hearing chamber, so quick to erupt with sound after budget presentations or procedural exchanges, now sat in taut, loaded quiet. The kind that comes not from confusion, but from conviction being challenged. Jasmine didn't lean forward anymore. She didn't have to. The question was already planted, and it wasn't going anywhere. And as the final echoes of her moral indictment faded into silence, Jasmine Crockett did not relent. She reached for her folder, not to repeat herself, but to escalate, because now it was time to turn the lens on the numbers and expose the real math of injustice. She opened the folder with the slow, calculated control of someone who knew exactly what it contained and exactly what it would do to the room. Her fingers brushed across the pages not like a legislator reading policy, but like a prosecutor preparing to unveil Exhibit A. "Let me be clear," she said, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable charge. "This isn't a speech. This is an audit." She raised her eyes and locked them directly on Steve Scalise, who now sat just a touch too still. "Because if this government is too broke to feed children or help our seniors breathe, then it's time we ask, who's actually draining the system?" She lifted the first sheet, holding it up just long enough for the camera to catch the seal of the Joint Committee on Taxation. "Let's start with ExxonMobil," she said, walking slowly to the edge of her microphone. In 2023, ExxonMobil reported $55.7 billion in profits. Their tax liability to the federal government? She paused, not for drama, but because the number itself demanded it. $0. Zero. Her voice didn't rise, but the air around her tightened. But they weren't alone. Amazon reported $36 billion in profit, paid nothing in federal income taxes. FedEx? Profitable. Chevron? Booming. Nike, surging, 5 multinational corporations, 5 tax returns that read like ghost pages. Empty where accountability should have lived. The screen behind her came to life, revealing a color-coded chart. Left column, reported profits. Right column, federal income tax paid. Line after line of zeros, punctuated only by government tax credits. Credits handed out like candy to conglomerates that had already devoured entire zip codes. And while they were paying nothing, Jasmine continued, they were also receiving hundreds of millions in public subsidies, paid for, I might add, by the very communities whose school cafeterias are now underfunded. Her eyes scanned the committee again. This isn't budgeting, this is sanctioned theft. Her voice sharpened, but it didn't shout. It didn't have to. I've heard my colleagues call single mothers on SNAP a burden. I've heard them question the work ethic of people who can't afford insulin. But I have yet to hear one of you call out the billion-dollar corporations that rig the tax code and walk away with bonuses, while teachers in my district buy pencils out of their own pockets. The room was still. Even the aides had stopped moving. Scalise shifted slightly in his chair, but said nothing. Jasmine's tone lowered, not to soften, but to cut deeper. You say the deficit is our greatest threat, but the truth is, it's not the deficit, it's the hypocrisy. She gestured back toward the chart, now zoomed in on Chevron's returns. Chevron received a $200 million tax refund last year. Refund, not a penalty, not a payment, a reward. Meanwhile, in the same year, 6,132 students in Louisiana lost access to free school lunches due to program cuts. Her voice cracked, not from emotion, but from restrained fury. That's not a coincidence. That's a choice. She stepped forward, closer to the mic, as if closing the distance made the weight of her words harder to ignore. So when Congressman Scalise says we need to make tough decisions, let's talk about how tough they really are. Because it's never tough to give another tax break to a billionaire. It's never tough to approve another loophole for a lobbying giant. What's tough, what's apparently impossible, is finding enough political courage to protect a child's lunch tray. There was no clapping, no shouting, just a silence so thick it pressed against the walls. She let it sit. She wanted it to sit, because she wasn't offering sound bites. She was forcing the chamber to stare into the ledger of its own complicity. Then finally she closed the folder, not like someone finishing a speech, but like someone preparing to return to court with more. These are not anecdotes, she said. They're data. They're policy outcomes. They're proof that this country is not broke, it's morally bankrupt. And the people who wrote the rules didn't fail us by accident. They did it by design. Her chair creaked slightly as she sat back down, but the room remained frozen, each member gripped by a sense that something fundamental had just shifted. Not in tone, in truth. Jasmine didn't look back at the screen. She didn't need to. She'd done what she came to do. She had changed the temperature in the room, without raising her voice, without slamming her fist, without blinking. And now it was their move. But if the tax data exposed corporate greed, Jasmine's next move struck deeper. Because this wasn't just about what the rich avoided, but about who enabled them and how that betrayal was quietly purchased, vote by vote, dollar by dollar. She slid the second folder across the polished table like a blade. The click of its clasp echoed faintly beneath the chamber lights. Let's stop pretending this is about oversight, she said, her voice tightening like a noose. Because if the American people are being asked to make sacrifices, they deserve to know who you've never asked to sacrifice a single thing. She flipped open the folder, revealing a stack of pages with FEC stamps, donation ledgers, and cross-checked corporate affiliations. This is public record, she continued, but what's public isn't always known. So allow me to make it plain. She lifted the top page and projected it onto the chamber screen. Donors to the campaign of Representative Steve Scalise, 2020 to 2024. Line after line of corporate entities, each one matched with a donation figure and an IRS tax liability reading 0. Her voice grew sharper, controlled but pulsing with clarity. Bayou Oil, $920,000 in contributions across 3 election cycles. No federal income taxes paid since 2018. The next page flipped. Westbridge Logistics, $740,000, tax exempt for 2 straight years. Gulf Power, $680,000. Received $50 million in federal subsidies in 2023 and paid zero in federal corporate tax. Each name she uttered was another crack in the dam, and she knew it. These companies aren't paying into the system. They're paying around it, and they're paying you to keep it that way. Her hand remained steady, but her words cut with surgical precision. This isn't fiscal conservatism. It's corruption with a filing number. Behind her, the screen split in two. Left side, tax liability, row after row of zeros. Right side, donation totals. Each in bold, each tied to a legislative vote Scalise had either sponsored or co-sponsored. Energy deregulation, logistics tax credits, accelerated depreciation allowances. Jasmine let the visuals speak for themselves for a beat, then broke the silence with a tone that no longer asked. It indicted. So let me ask you, Congressman, when you say we need to cut programs for struggling families, are you reading from the same budget where these companies live rent-free? Or is there a separate set of rules for those who fund your campaigns? Scalise remained motionless, but his stillness was not calm, it was calculated. Jasmine knew that stillness well. It was the kind used to wait out truth, but this time, she wasn't giving him the space to pivot. She stepped closer to the mic, lowered her voice, and made the charge personal. This isn't about business, it's about influence. You say you defend free enterprise, but what you're defending isn't freedom, it's entitlement, repackaged in corporate form and signed in PAC money. She held up one final page, a FEC itemization of bundled contributions from Gulf Power executives. 21 checks, same day, same address, all just under the reporting threshold, all just before you introduced House Bill 1221, the one that deregulated pipeline approval in vulnerable rural zones. There was no objection, no interruption, just a chamber gripped by the slow, creeping realization that the budget wasn't broken. It was bought. Jasmine returned to her seat like a soldier resheathing a weapon. So the next time you say we can't afford school meals, she said, voice barely above a whisper, look your donors in the eye and say it to them first. Look them in the eye, and then look in the mirror. The weight of her accusation still echoed. $3.8 million in donations, 5 corporations with zero tax burdens, and it pressed down on the chamber like a verdict waiting to be read. That's when Steve Scalise, cornered but defiant, reached for the microphone. Not with certainty, but with necessity. His fingers hovered above the button for a split second longer than usual, as if even he sensed the fragility of what came next. The red light blinked on, and his voice followed, measured, clipped, but taut with the strain of performance. This is a mischaracterization, he began, eyes darting toward the panel, but never quite landing on Jasmine. I don't write legislation to benefit donors. I support tax incentives because I believe in growth, because I believe in jobs. The words fell with practiced rhythm, but no weight. His tone was polished, but the tremor in his left hand betrayed him. We cannot demonize success, he continued. The American economy thrives when we allow innovation to flourish. Penalizing corporations for doing well, that's not how we grow this country. He paused just briefly, waiting for something. Approval, relief, maybe even applause. But the silence that answered him was colder than rejection. It was disbelief. Behind him, the screen still glowed with numbers he couldn't outrun. Profit margins in the billions, tax liabilities at zero. He didn't acknowledge them. He couldn't. So instead he pivoted, reaching for abstraction. These incentives are about competition, about keeping jobs in the U.S., about giving companies the tools to invest back into communities. He said it all like bullet points from a briefing memo. But in the face of the evidence Jasmine had just laid bare, it sounded less like defense and more like retreat. And Jasmine Crockett, still seated, still composed, didn't flinch. She waited a beat after his last word, then leaned forward with the precision of a surgeon preparing the final incision. Congressman, she said, voice steady, eyes locked, if those incentives are truly creating jobs and building communities, she let the next words arrive one by one. deliberate and exact. Then how do you explain 6,138 families in your district, losing access to free school meals this year? Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The silence in the room was already listening. You say these tax breaks build America, but where exactly is that America being built? Because it sure as hell isn't in the cafeteria of Lanier Elementary. The blow wasn't loud, but it was seismic. Scalise froze. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for the cameras to capture it, enough for the staffers behind him to lower their eyes. Jasmine wasn't grandstanding. She was interrogating the moral architecture behind his economic gospel, and she was finding nothing holding it up. You want to call this a distortion? She continued. Let's call it by its real name. Redirection. You're redirecting wealth upward, away from children, away from working families, and toward the very corporations that fund your campaigns. There it was. Not an accusation, a diagnosis. And in that moment, even Scalise seemed to know. There was no rebuttal that wouldn't sound hollow, because this wasn't just a question of economics. It was a question of who mattered when money ran dry. And she had just made it clear, in his America, the hungry were always the ones asked to tighten the belt. Her voice had already cracked the chamber's composure, but what came next wasn't rhetoric. It was arithmetic with consequences. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to speculate. She was there to show, with brutal clarity, what policies look like when they land on real lives. She stepped toward the center screen like a surgeon approaching the operating table, focused, steady, and unflinching. With a single press of the remote in her palm, the lights in the room dimmed by design, and a slide came into focus, stark against the darkened walls. 6,132 children. That was the number, printed in bold white font on a black background. No frills, no graphs, just a fact that hit like a punch to the gut. This, she said, her voice cold as steel, is how many public school students in Louisiana were removed from the free lunch program in the last 12 months. She didn't embellish. She didn't need to. The silence was doing all the work. 6,132 kids. That's 6,132 times a child sat in a classroom. Stomach empty, brain fogged, dignity hollowed out. She let that number breathe, not as a statistic, but as a weight everyone in the room was now forced to carry. Then slowly, she clicked to the next slide. A corporate logo filled the screen. Bayou Oil, sleek and proud, next to a line item from the IRS. $52 million in corporate tax exemptions. Jasmine didn't flinch. Same state, same year. A single company, Bayou Oil, reported record profits and walked away with $52 million in federal tax relief. Not deferred, not delayed, gone. The juxtaposition bled into the room like cold water soaking into concrete. That's not just a coincidence, she added, her tone deepening. That's a choice. A system that cuts lunch for children and cuts checks for corporations is not broken. It is functioning exactly as intended. She moved closer to the table, her shadow now cast across the wood between her and Scalise. So I ask you plainly, Congressman, she said, each word sharpened to a point, is this what budget discipline looks like to you? Her eyes bore into him now, not with rage, but with something quieter, heavier, grief dressed as defiance. Is it fair? Is it moral? Is it even remotely constitutional to take food off a child's tray in order to protect a luxury tax break for a corporation that already paid for your last campaign? Her finger tapped the screen once more. 6,132 versus 52 million, before she lowered her hand. Tell me, sir, which one of them do you think needed it more? No one moved. Not a single cough, not a shuffling paper. The silence was no longer discomfort. It was accountability. Raw, breathless, undeniable. Jasmine didn't look for applause. She didn't turn toward the cameras. She stood still, letting the numbers do what they were meant to do, wound the myth of fairness at its core. Because this wasn't just policy, it was theft, dressed in spreadsheets and voted into law. The chamber still pulsed with the weight of Jasmine's indictment. Children without meals, corporations without taxes. And before the silence could become a verdict, Steve Scalise leaned into his microphone, trying to reclaim authority not with truth, but with tone. "I've always believed in rebuilding the budget through discipline," he began, voice steady on the surface but taut underneath, like a man reading from a script as the stage burned around him. "Eliminating wasteful spending, creating space for innovation, giving American businesses room to grow, to hire, to reinvest." Each phrase was sharp, quick, rehearsed, a firewall of familiar sound bites laid brick by brick to shield himself from the numbers behind him. He avoided the screen entirely. It still displayed the two figures Jasmine had forced the room to face: 6,132 children cut from school meals, $52 million in tax breaks for Bayou Oil. His jaw tightened as he pushed forward. "We can't build a future by punishing the engines of our economy. We need to reward growth, not choke it." But the words, though fluent, now felt hollow, disconnected from the damage unfolding beneath them. His voice no longer filled the room. It echoed into it, uncertain of where it might land. Jasmine didn't hesitate. She leaned forward, didn't raise her voice, didn't need to. The stillness around her was working in her favor. Her delivery was quiet, surgical. "Mr. Scalise," she said, her tone like glass under pressure, "waste doesn't live in the hands of hungry children." She paused just enough for the silence to draw blood. "Waste lives in boardrooms that pay nothing to the country that gave them everything, and then turn around and give you $500,000 to keep it that way." Her hand remained steady on the table, but her words cracked the air open like thunder in a vacuum. "That's not fiscal discipline," she added. "That's transactional protectionism, for the rich from the rest of us." The reaction was instant, but silent at first. Reporters stiffening in their seats, press pool glancing at one another, fingers flying toward keyboards. A faint clicking began, like rain on metal, accelerating into a storm. Cameras panned toward Scalise. His face, once unreadable, now showed the faint twitch of someone who'd just been cornered with evidence he couldn't dismiss and logic he couldn't unspool. Jasmine didn't look at the cameras. She didn't need to. She looked directly at him. "You say you're saving America money," she said, low and lethal, "but you're not saving anything. You're selling the future of 6,000 children to one oil company." The room, now fully alert, felt like it might explode, but it didn't. It sat, stunned, stripped, silent. Because Jasmine hadn't just dismantled a defense. She had revealed its cost. And no one in that chamber could pretend they didn't see it. The numbers had exposed the machine. The corporate donations had revealed its engine. But now Jasmine Crockett leaned in, not with evidence, but with a question. One that didn't require a chart to cut. One that left no room to hide. She let the silence stretch a breath longer than expected, not to stall, but to shift the room from data to humanity. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned into the mic. Her voice softened just enough to force the chamber to lean forward. "Congressman Scalise," she began, "if a mother works 2 full-time jobs, 16-hour days, no weekends, no insurance, and she still can't put enough food on the table for her child, is that failure hers? Or is it failure of the system you keep defending?" Her tone didn't accuse. It indicted. The kind of calm that comes not from restraint, but from truth sharpened to a blade. Her words landed like weight, not noise, settling on every shoulder in the room. Scalise didn't move. His fingers froze above the papers he wasn't reading. The glare of the overhead lights caught his brow, now lightly beaded with sweat. She didn't flinch. Her gaze didn't wander. "Because that woman exists. Not in theory, not in abstraction, in my district, in yours." She gestured briefly, as if drawing a line across an invisible map of neglected people. "She makes your economy move. She cleans the hospitals, stocks the grocery shelves, watches your children. But when it comes time to balance your books, somehow she's the one who gets cut." The silence in the chamber thickened, turned weighty, as if oxygen itself refused to interrupt. "You call it budget discipline. You call it tough choices. I call it moral cowardice dressed up in fiscal language." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "And I want you to answer, on the record, under these lights, with this nation watching, What more does that woman need to do to be worthy of policy that works for her instead of against her? The question floated, unfinished yet impossible to answer. Scalise's jaw shifted slightly, but no words came, because she hadn't just challenged his policies. She had asked a question no spreadsheet could justify, a question that shattered the illusion that hard work equals security. And for a man who had spent a career speaking in numbers, she had just asked something terrifying, for him to speak from his conscience. The room had gone utterly still, not from courtesy, but from the kind of silence that swells before a collapse. And when Steve Scalise finally responded, it wasn't a rebuttal. It was a retreat dressed as resolve. He waited just a moment too long, not long enough to seem thoughtful, just long enough to reveal uncertainty. The lights above caught a faint sheen of sweat along his temple as he leaned into the microphone, jaw tight, voice low. "I believe in self-reliance," he said, the words coming out clipped, overly measured, like they'd been polished in a mirror but cracked on delivery. "I didn't come from money either. My family worked hard. We didn't have much, but we didn't expect handouts. I never waited for the government to feed me or solve my problems." His tone was meant to feel grounded, personal, but instead it rang rehearsed, the kind of memory summoned not to illuminate, but to shield. He didn't name where he came from. He didn't say who helped him. He only made himself the exception, the self-made man standing above the fray. But the numbers still glowed behind him. Children cut from meals, corporations cut from taxes. And nothing in his words touched them. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. Her hands remained folded, her shoulders relaxed, but her voice came sharp and unsparing. "No," she said, and the word landed like a stone against glass. "You didn't wait for the government, but your donors did." She tilted her head slightly as if genuinely studying him. "And they got what they waited for. Millions in tax breaks, in subsidies, in backdoor policy crafted to protect their margins." She let the chamber absorb the contrast before continuing, softer but deadlier. "Meanwhile, the kids in your district, they waited too. Waited for lunch, waited for a bottle of milk, waited for one policy, just one, that put their hunger above your donors' comfort." There was a stir now, a faint murmur, subtle but undeniable. A few gasps, the rustling of pens against notebooks. Someone in the press gallery muttered a curse under their breath. Scalise's shoulders tensed, his eyes fixed not on Jasmine, but somewhere just over her shoulder, anywhere but at her. Because she hadn't just exposed hypocrisy. She had drawn the line from his past to his power, and then used it to hold up the children his policies had abandoned. "This isn't about whether you waited," she continued. "It's about what you were never forced to wait for. It's about privilege passed off as principle, and the people who pay for it with growling stomachs and rationed futures." The blow hadn't come with shouting. It had come with precision, and now the weight of it sat in the room, undeniable, inescapable, and entirely earned. The chamber had already seen numbers, charts, and confrontations, but now the air thickened. Jasmine didn't just bring data this time. She brought a smoking gun. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. As Jasmine Crockett tapped her screen and the lights dimmed slightly for visibility, what appeared behind her on the monitor wasn't opinion. It was architecture, the scaffolding of corruption. "This," she began, her voice as flat and cool as steel, "isn't speculation. It's a memo. Internal, time-stamped, and released through the Freedom of Information Act." The screen displayed an email, stark against the dark background, the words cutting clearer than any accusation. "Refrain from altering Gulf power incentives. Significant PAC exposure and re-election funds implicated." She paused. No dramatic flourish, no commentary, just the raw, unfiltered text of influence exposed in its own words. She turned to the room, not to Scalise, to the cameras, to the public. "This did not come from a newspaper editorial," she said slowly. "It came from the office of Representative Steve Scalise, from an economic advisor whose job is to shape national budget policy." Then she pivoted, now facing Scalise squarely. "This isn't a constituent asking for help. It's a handler protecting a donor." Scalise visibly recoiled, not theatrically, but in the way a man does when the floor beneath him shifts half an inch and the world suddenly tilts. His hand moved to the microphone, stiff and mechanical, like every word he was about to speak had already been rehearsed behind closed doors. "I haven't seen that email," he said carefully. The sentence came out smoother than his eyes betrayed. "And I want to be clear, I've never made policy decisions based on political contributions." His voice tried to project composure, but the delivery was too polished, too sanitized. He didn't sound defensive. He sounded exposed. That's when Jasmine struck. No theatrics, just one sentence, straight into the rupture. "This isn't about you reading it," she said, tone glacial. "It's about the fact that your office did, and they wrote it not for the families losing health care, not for the kids losing their only hot meal, but for Gulf Power." She let it land like a blade pressed into silence. Her next words came even softer, yet somehow louder than anything spoken all day. "You want to talk about fiscal responsibility? Then explain this. Why are hungry children disposable while your campaign donors are sacred?" In that moment, the chamber didn't just freeze, it tilted. Reporters glanced at one another, fingers flying over keyboards. On the second bench, a Senate aide's face twitched with realization. A freshman Democrat exhaled slowly, eyes locked on Scalise as if watching a marble statue crack for the first time. Scalise's mouth tightened. No reply came. But Jasmine wasn't done. She advanced by inches, never crossing any decorum, yet collapsing every pretense. "This is not an abstraction. In the same fiscal year that memo was sent, 6,132 children in your home state lost access to subsidized school meals. Meanwhile, Gulf Power, your campaign's third largest donor, was awarded $52 million in tax relief." Her voice remained calm, but the room's pulse had changed. "So I ask again, not as a Democrat, not as a congresswoman, but as a citizen, who do you serve? Your constituents? Or the people who keep your war chest full?" The silence that followed was not passive. It was boiling. Scalise sat like a man calculating the cost of every word he'd ever spoken. His team behind him leaned in, whispering fast. But none of it mattered. Because in that moment, on that floor, Jasmine Crockett didn't just argue a case. She exposed a system. And for the first time in the hearing, it was Scalise who had to sit in the discomfort of being seen, not as a leader, but as a gatekeeper of inequity. And the chamber did not look away. The tension hadn't broken. If anything, it had only paused, holding its breath. Because now, stepping into the witness seat wasn't another politician with data or defense. It was someone who lived beneath the numbers, someone whose life had been shaped, scarred, by the very policies debated in abstract language. And suddenly the room had to listen differently. Her name echoed quietly as she was sworn in. Michelle Lattimore. She didn't wear power on her shoulders like the men in suits before her. She wore exhaustion, the kind that seeps into the bones of single mothers working back-to-back shifts and still going to sleep worried about milk money. Her blazer was slightly too big, borrowed maybe. Her shoes scuffed from miles walked without a car. But her voice was clear, and when she spoke, it didn't sound like testimony. It sounded like survival. "I have one son," she began, hands folded tightly in her lap. "His name is Jamal. He's 9, and he's smart enough to know when to lie to me. Like when he told me he wasn't hungry that morning, because he knew I hadn't eaten either." The room was dead silent, even the photographers too stunned to click. "He fainted during his spelling test," Michelle continued. "Collapsed. Just dropped. His teacher called an ambulance. They said it was dehydration and fatigue. But I knew what it was." She turned her eyes to the committee, not angry, not accusing, but unwavering. It was hunger. She breathed slowly, as if controlling the pace was the only way to keep from breaking apart. "We used to get meal assistance at school. That ended this year. No warning, just gone. The voucher didn't get renewed." Her voice trembled now, not from weakness, but from memory. "I called the district office. Yours, Mr. Scalise." Her words hit like quiet stones. "I asked if there was anything left, any program, any temporary solution. I wasn't looking for a handout. I was looking for a way to keep my child awake in class." There was a shift in the room. Some lawmakers looked down, others stared ahead like statues. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slightly. her expression locked not in sympathy, but in resolve. Meanwhile, Scalise kept his eyes fixed on his folder, though he hadn't turned a page since Michelle walked in. Michelle tightened her fingers. The staffer told me to try a church, a food bank, a charity. She swallowed. And I did. Every week since. I get up at 5 a.m. to beat the line outside St. Agnes Community Pantry, and I still end up 5th or 6th in line. And let me tell you, those boxes, they don't include school lunches, they include shame. My son asked me once, "Mom, are we poor now?" Her voice cracked, just once, then steadied. And I told him, "No, baby, we're just invisible." The weight of that word, invisible, landed like a thunderclap. Crockett's jaw tightened. A Democratic aide near the press rail was visibly wiping a tear. The media gallery sat in stunned stillness, save for a few fingers beginning to pound frantically on keyboards. Scalise still hadn't moved. Michelle pressed on. "I don't get tax breaks. I don't have a PAC. I don't fund campaigns. I clean offices no one thanks me for, and I stock shelves people walk past without looking. And somehow, I'm the one being told I need to tighten my belt." She paused and scanned the panel with eyes sharpened by desperation. "You talk about budgets. I live them. And I want someone here to explain to me how it makes sense to give $52 million in tax relief to a company like Bayou Oil, while cutting school meals for kids like mine. What's the math on that? What line in your spreadsheet justifies letting a child pass out in class?" Not a sound, no gavel, no cough. Even the marble walls seemed to be holding their breath. And then her final sentence fell, not shouted, not whispered, but spoken with the force of a mother who has already lost too much. "If your policies are built on the backs of hungry children, then maybe they shouldn't be standing at all." The air didn't move. Neither did Scalise. But in the silence that followed, something shifted. This wasn't about parties anymore. It wasn't about left or right. It was about a child named Jamal, and every child like him, who paid the real cost of power with skipped meals and silent collapses. And no chart or fiscal projection could unhear what had just been said. As the final echoes of Michelle's testimony faded into the marble walls, the hearing room didn't breathe. It braced. Her story had seared through the script, ruptured the rhythm. Scalise knew what came next could not be facts or figures. It had to be story. His own. He leaned forward slowly, as if the weight of memory settled differently than the weight of power. "Madam Chair," he said, voice low and steady, "I want to be clear that I don't take lightly what we've just heard. But I also want to remind this room that hardship doesn't only belong to one party." The room held still. Even the camera stopped panning. "I was raised in Jefferson Parish. We didn't have trust funds or golden safety nets. My father poured concrete until his hands cracked. My mother clipped coupons and stretched groceries with prayers. And you know what I never heard in that household? That we should wait around for the government to fix our lives." His hands folded in front of him. Not defensive, but deliberate. A practiced stillness. "I bagged groceries after school. I paid for my college tuition in monthly slips, not lump sums. There were nights I studied by the soft light of a second-hand lamp, while my parents argued over which bill could wait another week. But I pushed through. I believed in work, not welfare. And I still do." There was a glimmer of steel now in his gaze, subtle but unmistakable. He wasn't pleading for sympathy. He was constructing a shield. "So yes, I support fiscal reform, not because I want to see families struggle, but because I know from experience that strength doesn't come from dependency. It comes from determination, from grit, from refusing to surrender to your circumstances." He paused just long enough to let the silence fill with meaning. "Compassion," he said finally, "isn't measured by how much we spend, but by how much we expect people to believe in their own power." But Crockett wasn't interested in debating personal biography. She came to expose systemic betrayal. And no matter how Scalise framed his past, it could not erase the present harm caused by policies written in privilege and enforced with indifference. Crockett rose from her chair, calm but coiled, like someone who had spent the past 20 minutes not debating, but dissecting. She approached the committee's digital display and pulled up a presentation with the confidence of someone who knew the truth had waited too long in the dark. The first slide flashed onto the screen, a map of Louisiana divided by congressional district, glowing with dense overlays of data. "Let's stop pretending this is about numbers," she said. "It's about choices. Deliberate, documented, and devastating." Her pointer circled clusters of red-shaded parishes. "These are the areas where federal benefits have been cut in the last fiscal year. Free lunch programs, Medicaid outreach, food stamp offices." She turned, eyes sweeping across the room before speaking again. Slow, deliberate. "And now let's overlay race and income." The screen shifted. Yellow dots appeared across the map, concentrated in the same red districts, low-income households. Then another layer, green outlines, revealed parishes with majority Black or Latino populations. They matched, almost perfectly. The room fell into an eerie silence, the kind that only settles when truth becomes undeniable. Every district with over 60% white population, preserved, intact, but majority-minority districts, disproportionately slashed. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The devastation did the speaking. "Mr. Scalise, this isn't about self-reliance. It's about systemic removal. You didn't just tighten belts. You chose whose belts got ripped off." She advanced to the next slide, this time a bar graph. On one side, the average annual benefit cut per affected household in Orleans Parish. On the other, the average annual corporate tax break given to Gulf Power, Bayou Oil, and Westbridge Logistics, three of the top PAC donors to Scalise's campaign. "How do you explain this math?" she asked, her voice a blade wrapped in velvet. "Where a child in Shreveport has to split their lunchbox with their little brother, while a CEO in Houston gets another yacht deducted from their taxable income?" One member of the gallery audibly whispered, "Jesus," not even trying to hide it. Crockett turned back to the panel. Her tone softened, not in weakness, but in sorrow. "I grew up in a zip code where we didn't ask what your dreams were. We asked how many meals you skipped to get through the week. And the message your policies send, Mr. Scalise, is this: if you're poor, hungry, or Black, you better pray you're invisible, or you'll be the first one on the chopping block." She paused, letting the silence return, thicker this time. Then she delivered the final strike, not as a question, but as an indictment. "This map isn't a mistake. It's a mirror. And the reflection is ugly, because it tells us exactly whose America is being budgeted out of existence." No one moved. No one dared. Even the air seemed afraid to shift. The room was already trembling with unspoken truth. But Crockett knew. Numbers alone don't change history. For change to stick, it must wound the conscience. She stepped forward once more, the echo of her heels a metronome of defiance across the polished floor. Her hand hovered briefly above the mic, not to amplify volume, but to still the noise inside the chamber. Noise of excuses, justifications, distractions. The light above her pulsed like a spotlight, catching the sheen of quiet fury in her eyes. Her voice emerged, not raised but weighted, like a verdict. "We've spent hours today pretending this is about balance sheets," she said, pacing each word with surgical control. "Pretending that math is what's starving our children, that math is what's gutting our communities. But I didn't come here to debate decimals. I came here to speak truth." Her breath caught for a moment, not from nerves but from the sheer gravity of what came next. She looked directly at Scalise, then beyond him, to the camera's red light blinking like a heartbeat. "Don't call it a budget deficit," she said steady. "Call it what it is, a compassion deficit." The words hit like thunder with no lightning. There was no need for drama. The silence that followed was more damning than any outburst. No rustle of papers, no whispered rebuttals. Just the sound of collective reckoning pressing down on the room like a weight of air too heavy to breathe. She wasn't finished. She raised her arm and pointed, not at anyone, but at the screens still displaying data, the numbers of children cut from food programs, the tax breaks swallowed by corporations, the email threads soaked in quiet corruption. "This isn't fiscal discipline," she said. "It's moral negligence. It's theft with a spreadsheet. It's telling a mother working 2 jobs that there's no money for her child's milk, while you pour tax relief into a boardroom on the 42nd floor." A pause. Her voice dropped lower, the volume barely a whisper. But now everyone leaned forward. "We didn't run out of funds," she said. "We ran out of empathy. We ran out of the willingness to say, every child matters, even if their parents don't fund campaigns." The last sentence sliced through the oxygen, and then came the sound. Not applause, not yet. It was the scrape of a chair leg, someone standing in the gallery, then another, then hands, dozens, then hundreds. A crescendo of claps broke loose like a dam collapsing under moral pressure. Reporters glanced at each other, stunned. A senior senator shifted in his seat, visibly shaken. A producer in the control room muttered into a mic, "Mark the timestamp. This is going viral." And still, Crockett didn't blink, didn't smile, didn't move to claim her moment, because it wasn't a moment. It was a mirror, and the room was finally being forced to look. The echo of applause was still ringing in the corridors of Capitol Hill when the real tremor began. Not in the chamber, but across the networks, the feeds, the timelines. Words spoken in marble halls had broken through firewalls, headlines and spin. And the country was watching. It started with a single clip, just 27 seconds. A close-up of Jasmine Crockett's final line, her voice low and unwavering. "Don't call it a budget deficit. Call it what it is, a compassion deficit." A CSPAN intern uploaded it raw, unedited, without graphics or framing. No narration, no partisan filters, just silence. Then thunder. Within the hour, Drixie Tax The Truth was trending in 15 states. By noon, it was on the homepage of Reddit, with captions like, "She didn't just speak truth to power, she scalped it." On TikTok, teenagers remixed her quote over footage of empty school cafeterias and private jets. A side-by-side video showed kids crying after being denied lunch, juxtaposed with Bayou Oil executives receiving tax credits. It had over 4.6 million likes by the end of the day. CNN led with the headline, "Congresswoman Crockett dismantles tax hypocrisy in 90 seconds. MSNBC called it the moral mic drop of the year. Even Fox News, while trying to reframe her as performative, couldn't ignore the firestorm. Hosts stumbled over their talking points. One guest whispered off mic, "That was brutal," just before the cameras cut back. It didn't stop at media. The full hearing footage hit YouTube's front page within 8 hours, crossing 10 million views, then doubling before midnight. Comment sections turned into town halls. Veterans, single mothers, teachers, factory workers, people who had never typed a single sentence in politics, now spilling paragraphs of frustration, solidarity, pain. "That woman spoke for my daughter," wrote a nurse from Baton Rouge. "My son got denied school lunch over $2.35. Tell Steve Scalise to come explain that to his face." The emotional gravity shifted again when a Louisiana newspaper published an expose tracing corporate PAC donations from Gulf Power, Bayou Oil, and Westbridge Logistics, totaling $3.8 million across Scalise's last 3 campaigns. The reporter, a Pulitzer finalist, confirmed the FOIA email Crockett had exposed. The quote, "Don't touch Gulf Power, critical for PIC and re-election funds," was now printed on the front page, circled in red. And the internet exploded again. A digital petition to launch an ethics investigation into Scalise gained 700,000 signatures in 3 days. A nonprofit watchdog filed a formal complaint with the Office of Congressional Ethics by Friday morning. Hashtag variations began spreading like wildfire. Subsidized silence, meals and millions, who does he serve? But it wasn't just noise. There were aftershocks in places that rarely shake. A high school senior in New Orleans, whose free lunch had been cut that semester, stood up during a student assembly and read Crockett's quote. The video went viral, reaching Jasmine herself, who reposted it with one word: courage. An economics professor at Tulane rewrote her curriculum's opening lecture to include a breakdown of tax avoidance schemes like Bayou's, and showed Crockett's testimony as a case study in democracy through audit. Sunday morning, churches across Louisiana included her quote in sermons, not just as politics, but as moral clarity. Compassion deficit, one preacher said, is a phrase from God's own heart. Even Capitol Hill felt it, A Democratic whip privately told Politico, "I've seen hearings catch fire before. But this was a reckoning." A Republican staffer speaking off the record admitted, Scalise looked shook. He's usually got a playbook. But she burned the whole book. That Monday, Scalise's office released a vague press statement calling the accusations out of context and reaffirming his commitment to business growth. But no one was listening. Cable anchors spent more time dissecting his silence in the hearing than his words in the release. The frame freeze of Scalise under the hot camera light, jaw clenched, forehead shining, became a meme when the receipts show up before the excuses. Meanwhile, Crockett declined interviews for 48 hours. Her team posted just one clip on her social accounts, a slow zoom in of her holding up the FOIA email on the projector. The caption read, "We will not be quiet. We will not be bought." That single post gained over 12 million views and counting. But this wasn't just a media moment, it was a mood shift. A week later, a coalition of educators, cafeteria workers, and child welfare nonprofits drafted a new initiative, Lunch Justice, a bill designed to protect school meal programs from discretionary budget cuts. And they asked Crockett to be the sponsor. She said yes. On the Hill, other lawmakers began scrubbing their donor records. Some pulled back from scheduled appearances with Gulf Power lobbyists. Political analysts called it the Crockett effect, a chilling reminder that transparency, once triggered, is wildfire. The most watched moment came 9 days after the hearing. A televised roundtable moderated by CNN brought together former insiders, child advocates, and campaign finance experts to break down Crockett's testimony. One panelist, a former ethics counsel under President Bush, looked into the camera and said, "This isn't about party lines. It's about the moral floor beneath our laws." And Crockett just reminded the nation that we've been letting it rot. Her words had reached not just the people, but the pulse of the nation's conscience. And though she never asked for it, Crockett's speech was now a rallying cry, not just for hearings, but for mothers at school board meetings, for students with no voice, for teachers buying lunches out of pocket, for everyone who'd ever been told there's no money while watching millions drift into places no one could touch. And at the center of it all, a single voice, not raised in volume, but in unshakable conviction. She didn't shout. She didn't accuse. She just unveiled the math of injustice and let the country decide what to do with the truth. The world had reacted. The numbers exploded. The press scrambled. But for Jasmine Crockett, the firestorm of headlines meant nothing in that moment. The echo chamber had gone silent. Her shoes still clicked against the waxed floor of the Capitol, each step slower, heavier, not with defeat, but with the weight of something harder to carry than power. Truth. As Crockett exited the hearing room, the rotunda felt colder than she remembered. Her breath was steady, but her jaw remained tense. She had said what needed to be said, cut through layers of polished deception, stared down corporate-backed silence, and named what others had only dared imply. But there was no applause now, no cameras in her face, just marble, echo, and the trembling calm that follows a public reckoning. Security cleared the hallway. A few staffers stood frozen near the columns, whispering. Others avoided eye contact altogether. A man in a suit passed by holding a rolled-up New York Times, her photo already printed on the front page. "Deficit of compassion," the headline read, quoting her word for word. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She felt it. The adrenaline hadn't left yet. It roared quietly through her chest, a ghost of the battle still fresh in her veins. As she stepped into the open corridor leading to the elevators, her shoulders finally slumped, just enough to feel the fatigue seep in. Every statistic, every name, every rebuttal had cost her something. Courage had a price, and tonight she was paying it in silence. Then she heard it. Soft footsteps. Quick, untrained, not the shoes of a staffer or a reporter. The scuffing sound of sneakers running, not with fear but with urgency. She turned instinctively, just as the elevator doors began to slide open behind her. A boy, no older than 8, jeans torn at the knees, a backpack 2 sizes too big, and a paper crumpled tightly in one hand. His breath came in gasps. His cheeks were flushed, but his eyes, dark, clear, unblinking, were locked on her like she was something more than human, something sacred. He didn't say anything at first. He just extended his hand, the paper trembling in it. Jasmine hesitated, not out of fear, but because in a building where words had been weaponized, this silence felt like a sacred offering. She reached out and took the paper gently from his hand. It was a drawing, pencil on loose leaf, a tray with a sandwich, a carton of milk, and a heart beside it. At the bottom, scrawled in large, uneven letters, "Thank you for my lunch." No hashtags, no spin, no headline. Just the raw voice of someone who understood what no politician had admitted today. That survival was not a privilege, that hunger was not an abstract concept, and that dignity sometimes looked like one meal you didn't have to beg for. Crockett looked up, her mouth parted, but no words came out. She felt her throat tighten, not from debate, but from that unbearable kind of beauty, the kind that crushes you before it lifts you. "Was it you?" she finally asked, her voice a whisper. The boy nodded. "My mom said we're not supposed to talk to Congress people, but I saw you say the thing about the lunch and the rich people." Crockett crouched to meet him eye to eye. "You watched that?" He nodded again. "They played it in class. Our teacher was crying." For a moment, the hallway didn't feel like Capitol Hill. It didn't feel like power or conflict or strategy. It felt like church, like grace. And Jasmine Crockett, who had faced down billionaires, Supreme Court justices, and pundits looking to clip her voice, felt small in the presence of something infinitely larger than law. Gratitude. She folded the paper carefully, like it was evidence in a trial too sacred to touch. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he said, rubbing his eye with the back of his hand. "Well, Daniel," she said, voice steadying, "that drawing means more to me than all the headlines combined." He gave a small smile, the kind that breaks something inside you. "You gonna keep fighting the rich people?" She chuckled softly, then caught herself. "I'm gonna keep fighting for you." He nodded again. "Okay, I'm gonna tell my friends you're on our team." Then he turned and ran down the corridor, shoes squeaking on the polished floor. No bodyguard, no parent, just a kid with hope. Crockett rose slowly. She didn't cry, not yet, but her hand clutched that paper like it was a flag pulled from a battlefield, and in a way it was. She stepped into the elevator, doors closed. The silence inside was perfect, too perfect for words. She opened the note again, staring at the shaky letters, her fingers brushing the pencil marks like braille for the soul. And in that enclosed metal box, she allowed herself, just for a heartbeat, to feel the full weight of what she had done. Not just confronted power, not just revealed hypocrisy, but reached the one-person policy always forgets, the child it fails to feed. As the elevator descended, so did the noise of politics. So did the egos, the polls, the PACs. Down in that moment, only one thing mattered: a boy with a lunch he wouldn't have had, and a woman who refused to let that meal become collateral damage in someone else's ambition. As she stepped out into the sunlight, the city still buzzing with outrage and debate, she didn't wave to reporters or check her phone. She just walked, quietly, slowly, into the chaos of Washington with a child's thank you note in her hand, and a war still to fight in her heart. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.